Mendoza.
Here.
Helpern.
Here.
Chow.
Here.
Tanya Booty.
Here.
Hernandez.
Here.
Cohen.
Here.
Cartha.
Here.
I move that the Board of Education approve tonight's meeting agenda as presented. Second.
Helpern.
Yes.
Chow.
Yes.
Tanya Booty.
Yes.
Hernandez.
Yes.
Cohen.
Yes.
Mendoza.
Yes.
Cartha.
Yes. Okay. So we will move on to public comments. Members of the public are welcome and invited to address the board during open public meetings. The Board of Education will not permit the voicing of personal attacks against any district employee. Please remember to state your name and that you have 3 minutes to address the board. We have Elizabeth Powley.
Right here.
And please speak into the microphone to make sure that
Oh, you don't have any more for them?
Thank you so much. My name is Elizabeth Powley. I'm an Oakton parent. I'd like to speak tonight about the proposed expansion of TWI. I was unable to attend either of the community meetings held specifically on this topic. As I understand it, the district is considering expanding the TWI program at the elementary level next year. This is designed to respond to enrollment pressures, to preserve or rather reassert the 50-50 balance that is desirable, and to improve equity. It's on this last point that I want to speak. On the whole, it sounds like a great idea, but I want to focus on improving equity. I'm deeply troubled by the lack of diversity among English speakers in the TWI strand. The district's own data shows that the English-speaking students in the TWI are disproportionately white. I would argue that in the process of addressing equity concerns for Spanish-speaking students, by creating TWI, we've inadvertently created a disparity vis-a-vis Black students because of the way TWI is administered. I've looked closely at the institutional biases that are discriminating against Black students. I've drawn mostly from the district's own data and information. And my point is this: please don't let the disparity stand. Please seize the opportunity of TWI expansion to address these problems. On the surface, one of the biggest problems is disproportionate demand for the TWI program. According to the district's research, Black children are 24% of the district, but only 14% of TWI applicants. It would be tempting to focus on this demand issue. But the district's known about this demand issue for years. I found a Daily Northwestern article from May of 2006, more than 11 years ago, where district officials were lamenting the lack of demand among Black families. So it's clearly something that we've proven inadequate at addressing over more than a decade. And furthermore, it strikes me as hypocritical to address just the demand issue and not address the problems with supply. And that is, Black students may be 14% of applicants, but they are not 14% of TWI participants. So something's going wrong on the supply side as well. It would be cynical to just encourage more parents of Black children to apply to a program that is not admitting them at the same rate that is admitting white children. There are at least 3 ways in which the lottery discriminates, as I understand it. First is where the TWI classrooms are located. Over the past 5 years, the larger percentage of Black TWI applicants have lived in attendance areas with large Spanish-speaking populations. This reduces the slots at those schools. Where the largest class sizes are, apparently over the last 5 years, a smaller percentage of Black applicants have attendance area schools with large class sizes, so there isn't pressure to move them out. It's resulted in fewer selections of Black students. And lastly, sibling preference. Students with siblings in the TWI program who will remain in the program are given preference for TWI selection. Compared to white and Hispanic students, a smaller percentage of Black students have siblings in the program, and I quote, "This results in fewer selection of Black students." So we have a cycle that just continues and continues and continues. If your older siblings are in, you're in. This last point is particularly galling. It just perpetuates the problem. And while the district isn't technically allowed to use race in making TWI placements or other considerations, I'd argue that sibling preference is a strong proxy for race. Is that my time signal?
Yeah.
Okay. So join me at Oakton while I watch all the kids line up and look at basically segregation going on in our schools. There are right now, when I line up with my son in the morning, more white kids in ACC than there are Black kids in TWI at Oakton, a school that has a larger percentage of Black kids than than the average in the district. Thanks for hearing me.
Thank you. Okay. We will move. Oh, right, thank you. If anybody needs Spanish translation, please raise your hand now. We have an interpreter available. Okay, well, we'll just monitor, I guess, if people walk in.
In Spanish. I mean, let me say it in Spanish too. Si necesitan traducción, aquí tenemos al señor alemán para que está proveyendo traducción para la junta de esta noche. Gracias.
Thank you. Okay, and with that, we will move on to our discussion item tonight, which is the TWI expansion decision parameters. So, Paul and Stacy.
Stacy takes the podium. What we're providing tonight is an overview of the TWI program and where we need to, the fact that we have to expand, and then some of the parameters around how we're considering expansion. And we wanted to do that in this working session to hear our questions and concerns so that when we come back to the board in November with a recommendation, we'll have responded to the concerns, and then we'll come back to the board thereafter for a decision to move forward. So I turn to Stacy to kick off the conversation tonight.
All right. Thank you very much for the time and the opportunity to address the board. This evening, I'm going to do a couple different things. One, I am going to review a bit of basically the structure of the public engagement conversation that some of you are able to attend. We'll do that in a little bit more of a succinct manner, but I think it's important to understand the four arguments for why right now District 65 sees it as essential to expand the TWI program. Then we'll move into a bit of a conversation about where we are in the process of identifying a potential site for expansion. Okay? So just to make sure, again, we're all on the same playing field. Well, actually, so 4 points. Why do we need to expand the TWI? How does this align to our commitment to equity? What do we need to consider in site expansion, and what do we see as being our next steps? So we're all in the same place around TWI. It's important to understand a little bit of the history for our two-way immersion program, for ourselves and for other people that are interested in the topic. First off, in District 65, two-way immersion is a K-5 program, which essentially works to teach both Spanish and English as a dual language program. The program began in District 65 in 2001, and we're currently at 5 school sites. One has 2 strands of TWI, which means that we have 2 classes at each grade offering the two-way immersion program. The other sites, and that's Washington, the other 4 sites have 1 strand or 1 class per grade at the schools, and that is Dawes, Dewey, Oakton, and Willard. To understand two-way immersion, we need to really understand that the two-way immersion classrooms is a primary place where we deliver essentially our English language support for our native Spanish speakers for over 80% of our native Spanish speakers in District 65. So over 80% of our native Spanish speakers opt into our two-way immersion program as opposed to having kind of one-way support of developing English through our ESL programs. Our TWI program is a research-based model that draws off of some important research around language acquisition, and it's identified as being the most successful approach for students that are acquiring a second language because it builds off the strength of their own native language while also building on the strengths of classmates who have a different native language. The program goals: 1, we want to ensure that we have academic achievement for all students. The program itself is designed most specifically to serve our second language learners, so that's our first focus. That being said, we want to make sure that that environment and setting an educational opportunity is beneficial for all students. We are striving to achieve high levels of bilingualism and biliteracy. As we talk about this program and we talk about outcomes, it's extremely important to understand that our students are receiving instruction in Spanish and in English. And in the youngest grades, a very high percentage of that instruction is in Spanish. In kindergarten, our current allocations are 90% Spanish, 10% English. And what that does is it allows for our native Spanish speakers to tap into an area of strength that they bring into the classroom and support English acquisition over time. That being stated, it does mean that when we look at the amount of time for students to exit essentially EL supports through their access score, that it does take a longer period of time, but they exit being strong in 2 languages as opposed to 1. Lastly, the TWI program does focus on increased cultural competence, and it's increased cultural competence for all participants, and it's a deep value that's held amongst the instructors of our two-way immersion program. Why do we need to expand the TWI program? Essentially 4 key arguments for our expansion. 1 is increased student need, and that's a focus on the Spanish native language speakers in our district. 2, increasing community demand, and that would be from our English-speaking population. Program efficacy, stating that this program is working for our students. And then our commitment to equity, which talks about building on the strengths and the uniquenesses of all of our students. And this is a unique place where we tap into the strengths of a diverse group of students that are not always represented in our schools as strengths. As we're talking through this tonight, I've explained two-way immersion, but you'll see references to TWI-S, TWS. Those are our TWI students that are native Spanish speakers. TWI-X are native Spanish speakers who have exited their need for English language supports. However, they're still in the TWI program. So they've exited through their access score but remain in the program. And then TWI-E essentially are TWI students that are native English speakers. Our first kind of look at analysis of student need shows that in 2007-2008, we had 60 students that were TWI Spanish speakers in our kindergarten classrooms. We are currently, and this is the last year's count, at 84. This year's count in the memo was showed at 70, but that's pre-audit, and that number will tick up and it will be closer to 84, but we don't have a final number because that hasn't been completed yet. The important thing to know about that first row across, the 84 students are in the same number of sections. So we've gone from 60 to 84 students, but we haven't added a class. We have 6 classes across the district, so it means that we have a greater number of native Spanish speakers in the same number of classes. One of the key tenets to the two-way immersion model is that it should be, the classes should be 50-50, 50% native English speakers, 50% native Spanish speakers, because it creates an environment where students can learn from each other, support each other in a balanced environment. What we also notice in the second row there is that the overall number of kids in our K-5 classrooms has gone up also by 40%. So essentially, we are educating students in classrooms that have a higher density of native Spanish speakers. The way this plays out, whoops, sorry, I thought there was an arrow there, is that our 50-50 allocation, 50% of native English speakers and 50% of native Spanish speakers, is no longer present. We were at 50-50 in 2007-2008. This past year, we're at 65-35, and our numbers are just about there. I think we're about 64-36 for this year, but again, not audited, not finalized. So what this does is it leaves us out of balance in our classrooms, and the impact of this is different across the district. Our 2 schools where we are most out of balance are Dawes and Willard. At Dawes in our kindergarten space last year, we had 18 native Spanish speakers and 5 native English speakers. And in Willard, 17 native Spanish speakers and 6 native English speakers. And this occurs because it is our obligation to serve our native Spanish speakers in their place of choice to receive their English language services, because that is an obligation that we owe to that population, and it's also a state required need. When students' scores are not at a certain point on access, we need to deliver English language services, and our families at a rate of over 80% opt to participate in the TWI program. When we look across the board, what we see is that we are not at 50-50 at any one of our schools right now. Additionally, one thing that we need to realize, and I just mentioned that there are state rules and compliance that go along with the programs and providing students that are requiring a second language, acquiring English, is that the student-teacher ratio in any one of these programs should be 90% of the general classroom average at that grade level in that attendance site. So if our classrooms at a given site, the non-TWI classrooms are at 25, that TWI classroom needs to be at 90% of that 25 in order for us to be in state compliance. This is increasingly becoming a very significant challenge for us because, as you notice, when we have a very high number of native Spanish speakers that are requesting TWI and are requiring these services, it is much harder for us to keep classroom sizes at 90% of that general education size. When we take, so moving on to the second piece, analysis of community demand. So one, we've established that there are native Spanish speakers that are demanding the program at a rate that outstrips our ability to implement the model with fidelity, which would be 50-50. Second, this slide shows essentially that we have a high number of applications. We have about 800 students in last year's kindergarten class that this data comes from. Of the 800 students, 140 so 800 students, and then we need to exclude the native Spanish speakers. And so that would move us probably more to about 700. But out of that number, 140 applied to the TWI program as native English speakers. So of the subset of our 800, the students that applied, we had 140 native English speakers who said that they wanted to be part of the TWI program. In 2012, we were able to accept 46% of those students. And that represented 56 students getting the opportunity as native English speakers to be part of our TWI program. This year, because of the rising number of native Spanish speakers, which again, the program is here to meet their educational needs, we were able to accept 45, and this was the past year, which was a 32% acceptance rate. So what this establishes is that in the process of expanding TWI, not only do we have native Spanish speakers who can and should be better served in a 50-50 classroom, we also have complementary demand from native English population to fill these classrooms. The other piece around community demand is a bit more of the narrative of support for the program. One, TWI supports a community value of diversity. District 65 has made a very significant commitment to equity and to valuing diversity, to understanding differences, and to building on strengths. And TWI does this, and it does it incredibly well. Second, bilingualism is a global skill. It's a skill that as students exit high school and go into college is valued. It's a skill as students exit college and go into the workforce is valued. Not only do students acquire a second language, be it English and Spanish, but they develop a deeper understanding of people from different cultures, and ideally have that opportunity to continue that through middle school and high school. Currently, however, we are at K-5. This slide essentially shares a quick quote from a parent. We do hear this from a number of different families about we moved to Evanston because we're excited about the potential of this program. This particular parent was able to access the program and has really experienced what she sees as being an extreme benefit of being in the program. We very much also get the flip side of this quote, which is, I was here, I want to be part of this program, but I have not been able to access it because my student wasn't accepted, which is, Ms. Powley mentioned that in addition to the fact that we do see an underrepresentation of Black students in the students that are represented in TWI and the native English speakers in TWI. Analysis of community demand. We've done 2 different engagement strategies over the last 6 months. One was through phone outreach to our JEH families, and the rationale for reaching out to our JEH families is that JEH, one, represents students that will be entering District 65, and 2, JEH serves a high number of Black and Hispanic students. And so the outreach to JEH families was to really address what demand do you have for this program? What knowledge of this program do you have? And what would be your voice about whether it was in a neighborhood school or a community school? And the majority of respondents communicated interest. We did note that there was a lower rate of awareness of this program amongst the Black population than the Hispanic population. And the survey participants also communicated that they were relatively benevolent at that point about whether it was a neighborhood or a magnet school. There is a reality, however, though, that they are in that JEH space prior to going to District 65, and some are already engaging in busing. So they were open to those options. Second set of information on community need were the 3 outreach sessions that we've done this fall. We did 3 sessions, one with the Bilingual Parent Advisory Committee, and then one at Fleetwood Jourdain and one at Washington. We had over 60 community members represented at those sessions. And they led to some very good discussion question and answer and conversation and input to our thinking around selection criteria for sites. The first question that the group was asked was, what are the strengths and concerns around the arguments for expanding TWI? And resoundingly, the community groups came back saying, the rationale for expanding TWI is extremely clear to us. We see that there is a need, and we see that this is something that should happen. The challenging part of the conversation, which I think all of the community members very much understood as we got deeper into the conversation, is that there is no easy way to expand TWI. No matter how we do this, there is an impact on a group of people and a school. What we have to realize is that expanding TWI meets a set of educational needs for students that aren't being adequately supported at this point in time. We're not delivering a model with fidelity. If we were in a district or a space that had a school with 6 extra classrooms, we could possibly add a new strand of TWI. But that's not our reality. Our schools are full. Our schools have lots of students in them. We do not have 6 extra classes in any given school. So as the community groups began to understand that with all change, we have to look at what are the pros and cons and find the best possible pathway for expanding to do the right thing for students, and that in the short term, there will be challenge and pain associated with change, but in the long term, we need to do best by kids, and ultimately school communities should and could and will come around to embracing the diversity of the schools and the value of the program. Just as our 5 schools who currently host TWI very much value that program. Because that was a voice that came up in the conversations too. You're not taking away our TWI strand, are you? And the intention is not at this point to take away a TWI strand, it's to add a TWI strand to serve more kids and to get an increased balance 50-50 in our program and to improve our outcomes. Participants in those sessions then moved into a conversation about what should we consider in regards to our selection criteria, and then what are some of the other things that you would like us to consider in this process. And 2 areas that did come out in those conversations were, one, there was a voice at all 3 sessions about taking a look at expanding TWI or dual language programming to middle schools to ensure that students have a K-8 experience as opposed to a K-5 experience. And there were also clear voices about us taking the opportunity to take a look at selection criteria, both around underrepresentation of Black students in TWI, as well as questioning about whether simultaneous bilinguals should be considered in that process. Third argument for the program is program efficacy. This is the graph essentially that goes to Thomas and Collier, which is the primary research behind this program, or the most, it's a meta-analysis. And what this chart shows is that this approach of building both English and Spanish is in the best long-term interest of our students in acquiring their language skills. The second chart here shows essentially students' access scores in grades 1 through 5. And what is important to note here, a couple things. TWI is two-way immersion. TPI would be what we refer to as English as a Second Language program, or ESL programming. So they meet with an ESL teacher either in pull out or push in, but have their skills to develop the English language are supported, not the Spanish language. So it's our ability to support the acquisition of English, whereas in TWI we support the acquisition and strength and development of Spanish and English. What this chart shows is that our TWI students who, for our TWI native Spanish speakers, are 89% low income, enter in their grade 1 access scores, have a lower access score. But by the time we get to 5th grade, we see that our TWI students have grown past and have the highest level of access, the greatest access score among our 3 programs. And so this is a comparison of TWI, TPI, and families that opt out or waiting on services. So we're looking specifically at second language learners here. A couple quick notes. When we think about these different populations, they do represent, in some cases, a different group of families. Our TWI families run between 89 to 92%, or our native Spanish-speaking TWI students are generally 89% low income most recently. Our WAVE students are much closer to about 20 to 25%, and our TPI students are about 60% low income. And so we do see difference in the demographic groups. Another piece of information that was asked was what percent of the native Spanish speakers do opt into TWI as opposed to either waiving or accessing our ESL services. And it is over 80% of our native Spanish speaking families do opt into TWI. The third slide here demonstrates what we refer to as the zone of biliteracy. The column on the left represents 64% of the students meeting either EDL or DRA. That's our one-to-one literacy assessment. And DRA is when we give it in English, EDL is when we give it in Spanish. All right? And we assess the language development in both languages for our students in the TWI program. The column on the left shows us that 64% of those students in second grade met those DRA benchmarks. But when we consider something called the zone of biliteracy, which takes into account students that are strong in both languages and close to benchmark, but not yet at benchmark in both. So essentially simultaneous bilingual people that are very strong in both languages, but aren't at benchmark in one. And so if we consider that, and that's an indication of strong language development. If we consider that, we see the percent of students that are meeting our end of year benchmarks jump to 74%. I've got 3 slides here that reach further into middle school to talk about success of program. The first one is college readiness benchmarks. And college readiness benchmarks set a high level of achievement for our students. And what we do see here are a couple different things. One, we see that our program, that we still have some work to do to accelerate achievement towards college readiness benchmarks. So, sorry, I'm on my wrong slide mentally, I apologize. This is MAP data for Spanish. So third graders, what we've done over the last 2 years is that we've given MAP in Spanish in math. And the reason we've done that is that we give math instruction in Spanish. And we had an open question. Our question was, if we assess students in Spanish, would we see greater levels of understanding? And what we saw here, particularly for our TWI ELs, so our TWI English language learners, which would be our native Spanish speakers, that the percentage of students who met college readiness benchmarks moved from 18% to 25%. Now when I look at this, I clearly want to see numbers that are higher, but what I also notice is that that's a 33% increase in the students that are demonstrating that they're hitting their college readiness benchmarks when they are given an opportunity to take an assessment in their native language. And I think that's an important thing for us to understand, because at times when native Spanish speakers are engaged in our schools, which are predominantly English, we undervalue the knowledge and content that they have. And what this illustrates for us is that we were able to assess that 33% more of our native Spanish speakers actually had a level of mathematical understanding that meant the college readiness benchmarks while still acquiring English. And that is really powerful and important for us to understand. We did see when we did this that for our non-ELs, when our English language speakers took the test in Spanish, there was a small dip in the percentage of students who met that college readiness benchmark. But again, when we think about the fact that these are native English-speaking students taking a math assessment in Spanish, and a high percentage are still demonstrating a level of college readiness, that's a solid complement to the program for students that are acquiring Spanish. And so that's an important point. The column all the way on the right shows our percentage of non-ELs, and so those would be people who essentially took the test in English, and what we see is a comparative district benchmark. Now we're going to move to the slide that I thought I was talking about on the last slide. All right, so when we talk about MAP, we're moving into middle school space. We have a couple different things on this chart. We're again at college readiness benchmarks, and we're looking at reading and math. I'm going to start with the free and reduced lunch. What we do know, as we've stated before, is that a higher percentage of our native Spanish speakers are in the free and reduced lunch category. What we see here is that there is close to comparable performance about the percentage of students reaching college readiness benchmark for our students that are classified as free and reduced lunch. We still do not see the same level of performance yet, but it's close. And then in the no free and reduced lunch, we still see some gap, but when we step back and we evaluate the fact that we have 1, acquired a second language, 2, received far more instruction in Spanish, and far less instruction in English. We see that students are still achieving at high levels. And so when we control for that socioeconomic, we see that students are at a comparable level. When we move to the 40th percentile, what we see is also increasingly positive for our student achievement. Before I jump to, I want to point out something. In the TWI program, we made a significant shift in program to the biliteracy model. And we made this shift just over 6 years ago. And so the students that we are looking at data here did not have the benefit of working through the full TWI program with the biliteracy model, which which informs our current language allocations. And so one of the things interesting question and comment that came up at the community engagement forums was, what do we see as far as a shift in outcome for students that have been in the TWI program throughout our period of focusing on the biliteracy model, and that is something that we're looking at, but that group has just entered the 6th grade. So they that first cohort just exited 5th grade. When we take a look at our data for students at or above the 40th percentile, what we see when we take a look at 6th grade and 8th grade, our TWI students are outperforming our students that are other former EL, so those would be the students that were ESL, and they're also, they are not yet out their equivalent performance in math for students that have waived. And again, we need to pay attention to the fact that these are somewhat different groups of students. But we take a look and we see very significant percentages of students that are at or above the 40th percentile when we take a look at both reading and math. Particularly if we look at the TWI, when we look at 92% of our students are above the 40th percentile in reading, and as well as 74% for free and reduced lunch. Those are high levels of success. When we move to looking at, and part of our district scorecard is we look at students in the bottom quartile. When we see students entering 6th grade, we see that our TWI students are pretty much at the national average. 26% of our students are in the bottom quartile for reading and 24% in math. But what we notice when we look at the 8th grade data is that by 8th grade, that percentage of students that is in the bottom quartile has shrunk from 26% to 8% and from 24% to 9%. And what we really believe that this speaks to is that students, as we move through acquiring 2 languages, this process does take time, and it takes time for students to then really begin to apply their learnings to the content area. And so the fact that we see that there's a much smaller percentage of students in that bottom quartile than national averages and between that 6th and 8th grade window is an illustration to us that students continue to grow and apply the learnings and get stronger in their native English language during the middle school years. 4th conversation and commitment around expanding TWI is equity. The equity policy, district policy, each and every one of you is a part of creating. It is an important document for us. I think keys that we draw out of this is we have a commitment to build on students' strengths. TWI absolutely taps into building on students' strengths. Their language and their culture are framed as strengths, which is incredibly important and is unique to this program in comparison to other things we do within the district. Additionally, TWI gives us an opportunity to recruit a more diverse workforce and to approach and think about problems and discussions from a different perspective. One of the things that we've done from the curriculum and instruction side this year is that we have framed the work in curriculum instruction as our job is to design core instruction in English and in Spanish. This is part of our core direction, and we need to be responsible for that as well as all the layers of intervention and thinking about how to make that instruction culturally relevant. Our TWI teachers are leaders in thinking about how to do that, and they're important voices in our district. I also want to tap in a little bit to the Courageous Conversations definition of educational equity, because this really is at the heart of our Beyond Diversity work, and I think this is an important message in District 65. Educational equity is about raising the achievement for all students while narrowing the gaps from the highest and lowest performing students and eliminating racial predictability and disproportionality. TWI is an opportunity where we are able to put students from different languages and cultures together and have them support each other in their areas of strength. And that is an important opportunity and growth space for both languages, both sets of students, because it does allow us as we move forward to see strengths in people and to tap into those with stronger relationships. The last piece of this that I want to tap into, because it's important as I shift into our conversation about site consideration, the Equity Walk highlighted that there was a strong voice from parents, students, and teachers stating that the single strands of TWI felt very isolating. And we heard this echoed in our community engagement sessions as well, that it, from the teacher's point of view, that it's not always easy to pair and to collaborate because you are the sole person at that grade. For students and parents, there's a conversation of the fact that it leads to a narrower group of peers and friends, that you don't have as much opportunity to engage with the broader school community. And we've heard this in some of our school climate work as well. So that is important, and also Corey highlighted in that report the underrepresentation of Black students in the TWI program as well. So what we've done essentially is take the information that we brought to this group last spring, take the community engagement information from this fall, and really weigh what we see as being important criteria for site expansion. And the voices of the community engagement sessions were very important for that. And we've taken those notes and combined those with some of the work we've done to arrive at what I have up here as being the factors that we see as being most significant. I have in the board memo a balance of more factors than this, but these are the ones that we see as having the most weight and most significance. The first one is the number of TWI strands at current school site with consideration for remaining strands. What this essentially means is that we are hearing a strong message that having the single TWI strands is not as beneficial. And so as a result, what we're looking at is, one, would we add a TWI strand to a school that has an existing TWI strand? Or two, would we add TWI strands at a place where maybe there's no TWI strand, but we can see the ability to add a second strand soon or at the same time? So we don't want to create a system where we are adding another single strand without the possibility of having a second strand to go with it. A key piece of this, when we look at the numbers, adding one strand gets us moving in the right direction. But we need a second strand to get back to 50-50, to get back to a closer balance. And so we are still considering schools that potentially do not have TWI, but they would have to have the ability to add a second strand to make it feasible, because we don't want to continue to have single strands by design. Second factor that has had significant weight is average monolingual class size. So when we look at the non-TWI classrooms, our English-only classrooms, what is the average class size in those classrooms? And the reason that this is important is if we designate a strand of TWI, it has to replace an existing English-only monolingual strand. That gets back to we don't have 6 extra classrooms anywhere. So it means that essentially if we had 20 students in this classroom that is now going to be TWI, 10 are going to go to native Spanish speakers and 10 would remain for native English speakers. And so that does mean that if that classroom would normally have been filled with 20 native English speakers, it means that 10 of those students, quote unquote, are displaced. They would be moved to other classrooms within that school. And so we are preferencing schools that have a lower average monolingual class size, because it means that if students are displaced by creating a TWI strand, there'd be the possibility to absorb those students into other classrooms within that building without overly impacting class size or moving past our class size guidelines. The other factors which are not here that are connected to this is that we are also looking very much at permissive transfers in and out of schools and magnet applications in and out of schools. And that allows us to see how many students do we have in the school by pattern that aren't necessarily within the neighborhood attendance boundary. Because that is something that we control as a district. The students that are there would certainly remain, but we could limit the number of permissive transfers in if that is part of what is driving up class sizes. So we're taking a look at the different factors to say, what control do we have over the class sizes in this building? What's the average size? And what's the number of permissive transfers in and out that impact those numbers? Because those are things that we can control to manage class sizes, to make sure that the impact is fair and works well for students and families within the school. The third factor is the number of native Spanish speakers by school area in which they live. And that's a little bit of a run-on, so I apologize on that one. But we're specifically taking a look at, for neighborhood school boundaries, what percentage, what number of native Spanish speakers live in that home school boundary. And this we see as being important because those students, if we do put a TWI strand in a neighborhood where we already have a density of native Spanish speakers, then that allows those students to access the program in their home school and does avoid busing to another location. And we do have situations where we have students being bused from one TWI attendance boundary to another TWI attendance boundary because we don't have space for them in their homeschool program right now. So that is something that we're looking at. We're also with that look at where we are seeing growth in the native Spanish speaking population by neighborhood schools within the district. The fourth indicator here is we're looking at the percent change of projected enrollment from 2021 to 2016. And the reasoning for that is that if we see that the enrollment is projected to grow significantly over that 5-year window of time, that would not be potentially a good place to put a TWI program unless your average monolingual class sizes are still quite low. Because we do not want to have a situation where we put a program into a school and then we run into a situation where we are hitting up against the class sizes within our district. And so that's a way for us to look at those projections and be thoughtful about that aspect, because we are trying to pay attention to the impact on class sizes and the impact on school community. We are also weighting school culture and openness to the program, and that one, I have educator after it. We are taking a look at the 5 E's and kind of the collective responsibility measure there, because one of the things that is really essential in a school community that is hosting TWI and it becomes a TWI community is that teachers and faculty and everybody is willing to work together for the benefit of all students. Because when we talk about families, teachers, and students saying that at times things feel siloed, if we have a strong sense of collective responsibility, we feel that's an indicator of a school community that would be more ready and to welcome TWI program and TWI students into the building. Because this is not a side program. This is a core piece of your school, and it's something where we all have an opportunity to really embrace and make it part of our school and part of our school culture. And for the schools that do have TWI right now, that is, again, a very vital piece of their personality and their identity. There's pride in having a TWI program. There's pride in having that kind of part of that life of their school. And so that is important. And then the last aspect that we're weighting most heavily is TWI program previous performance. And that is, we're taking a look at the last 5 years of data around the students that have been in the TWI program and where do we see the highest levels of success. And for this particular data point, we're looking at our DRA data through 3rd grade. And so that kind of early language acquisition, where do we see the highest percentage of students on average meeting DRA benchmarks? And that's a way for us to get a sense for our TWI programs. What do we see for relative strength of program? And then the proxy for schools that are either magnets or non-TWI is to look at overall school performance and to get a sense of that. As I mentioned before, there are possible scenarios. And I also mentioned that in getting to this, I think this is exciting. I think this is important work, and I think adding a TWI strand is critical to us providing high quality programming for our native Spanish speakers. That being said, this is not an easy decision, and it'll take work with schools and communities to make this work well, but we're committed to do this. The scenarios that we are looking at would be adding one TWI strand at a school with no existing TWI strands. In the memo, we broke out some of the pros and cons for you. There, as I mentioned, a real challenge is we don't want to create another siloed, single-strand TWI school. We're hearing from the equity report, we're hearing from community engagement sessions that that's not optimal. So that would be considered if we could see the ability to add that second TWI strand Ideally, we don't want to create any scenarios where, in the long term, we have a single strand of either dual language or monolingual. Because if I had a 3-section school and we went to 2 sections of TWI, now we're down to 1 section of English only or monolingual, and that's not ideal either. And so we want to see the possibilities of making sure that we don't have single strands of any of our offerings in this situation. The second scenario would be adding 1 or 2 TWI strands at a school with an existing TWI strand. And as I said, adding a single strand doesn't get us close enough to getting to 50-50. Long term, we need 2 strands. And not long term, we need 2 strands now. If we need to step into them, we step into them. The request would be to set up the plan for both strands at this time. And doing that at an existing TWI school would allow us to build on the strength of existing teachers and existing program. Going into a school that doesn't have a history of TWI is a little bit of a tougher lift, because there isn't anybody within that building that has that knowledge of this is how a TWI program runs. Our hope is that we would have leaders within the district step up and help us with that work, but going into a school that has TWI already allows us to build on the strength of an existing team. And adding 1 or 2 at a school would allow us to move away from single strands to 2 or 3 strands. Adding 2 or more TWI strands at a neighborhood school with no existing TWI strands. And so that's that piece of, if you add 1, ultimately it's going to be best to add 2 to stay away from the isolation. And then there is also the possibility of adding 2 or more TWI strands at a magnet school, and neither of our magnet schools have TWI, so that would be with no existing TWI strands. And the pros and cons there are very similar to the first bullet of adding TWI when you don't have any existing. You don't have the knowledge capital to tap into, but you do have opportunity to be able to potentially move to a majority of TWI strands or a TWI school. All right. What we see as being next steps between now, we would like to bring forward a site recommendation on November 6th. Our next steps are to finalize evaluation and weighting of selection criteria. Part of the conversation tonight and continuing to formulate the feedback that we've already gotten will help to move us to that place. Once we've determined a recommended site for TWI expansion, we'd bring that here on November 6th. We also plan to engage with site leadership, staff, and families to discuss TWI program and impact of expansion at that identified site. And we would see beginning that process prior to coming here on the 6th at the selected site, so that there's conversation already taking place about that possibility. We also see the need to begin the work to lay out a strong foundation for TWI expansion, including school and community engagement, so faculty recruiting and student recruitment. Part of our timing on this is that we want to be in place to offer this strand for next year, which means that we need to make this available for kindergarten applications in January. And then we're also looking at partnering with RAD to discuss selection criteria around TWI based on the community feedback that we have received. And we've already begun that conversation in the lane of sharing the feedback that we have and opening up that conversation. At this point, I think I will stop talking and allow any questions.
Thank you very much for that presentation. And before I turn to questions, I just want to preface this that, originally we were planning to be looking at a recommendation of the site today. As I think we can all see, this is an incredibly complicated decision. And so we weren't ready for that today. But as you said, I think this is something that ultimately will be a benefit for our district as a whole and for whatever school community is ultimately selected. But there will be some change management and some growing pains that are going to be associated with that. So I think having this discussion now, so even though we don't have a site identified, understanding what the considerations are for us as a board, for the community, is really important, and I think will help people understand. And it won't totally eliminate the growing pains that are going to happen, but it can help ease it. So I think it's important that we're having this discussion right now, and I really appreciate the way you've laid this all out. I think this was fantastic.
Thank you. And we wanted to make sure certainly that we had done the necessary thinking and really thought to before putting that final set recommendation on the table. And so
Absolutely.
I felt it was important to to wait a couple weeks before bringing it forward
No.
based on the feedback that we received.
Absolutely. And now, also, just to clarify too, and I know we'll get into questions about timeline, but November 6th is the plan for having that
Yes.
site-specific recommendation.
Yes.
So I'm going to turn it to questions. I'm going to suggest that just to kind of keep it within the framework of how the presentation was, maybe first we can start off with questions around the community outreach and any questions about the need for expansion, and then we can turn to questions about the criteria and some of the considerations for where that expansion should take place. So, with that, does anybody want to start off with questions on the outreach or?
I have a question. And if we have data-related questions,
Yeah,
should that,
yeah,
sit?
I
Can
think-
that go now?
Yeah,
Okay.
I think that makes sense now.
So the first question on outreach, in terms of, as we later look at criteria, the outreach was done through JEH, primarily on demand. Do we know anything about, or have we done any outreach to native English-speaking audiences to say if this, because one of the options is magnet potentially, if these were options outside your local attendance area, would, is that a bigger hurdle to participating? Because to get to 50%, we obviously want participation from those groups as well. Or potentially, because you had the 140 applications that come from those areas, what proportion of those come from the actual neighborhood school or are some coming in from other schools? I'm just trying to get a feel for how, what the demand would be for that, because I know it is a hurdle to go to a magnet school, generally speaking, but this would have a clear point of difference, obviously, but do we have any data?
So I do not have specific numbers to share with you on that. We do have data on the number of families that get bused from their homeschool attendance boundary to a school for a magnet program or for TWI in this situation. So we do see that there are native English-speaking families that opt into the program and opt for busing in order to participate in the program. So we do see that. We know that we have a higher participation rate within the schools where we offer the program, but we also know that we have families that intentionally pick those areas in hopes of being able to participate. So we see families that get bused in for the program that are native English speakers and value that program. We hear a voice at the community sessions and in our surveying in the spring that says we would bus for this program if we had the opportunity from native English families, English-speaking families, and we see that that there are members of our community that consider this program when thinking about where they want to ultimately live in Evanston.
Okay. And that's not to, I just want to make sure it's clear. In our packets, we had data that said specifically for native Spanish-speaking families that was, they were fine with that. So I'm not prioritizing one over the other. I just didn't, there wasn't data on the other.
But we do have full data as well. We have full busing information.
Thanks. I had a couple data specific, well, actually, I'll ask the data question when it comes to criteria because it kind of relates to criteria, so.
I have a couple of quick questions about the outreach. Why is it, I know 80% is it's a great number as far as participation of native Spanish-speaking families participating in TWI. Why isn't it 100?
One have not gone that deeply into that at this point in time. I know there are families that enter in the district that are native Spanish-speaking families that do have very distinct preferences, in some cases for TWI, in some cases for favoring towards ESL, and I think families really need to dig in and decide in some ways what they think is going to be in the best interest of their individual student. And in this situation, they have that opportunity to really evaluate and weigh that based upon their criteria and their beliefs. We did also do some data work to see what percentage of the students stay in the program, and what we see is year in, year out that we're not losing, that we're essentially we keep about 95% of our native English speakers and our native Spanish speakers annually grade by grade. And so that boils down essentially to a student a year.
Do we know if that's the same for the native English speakers as
It is
well?
actually
That same
almost
attention?
exactly the same.
That's great.
Yep.
The other question I have, it kind of relates to that first one, is are we, and I apologize for asking a legal question, but are we legally obligated to provide both methods of English language instruction?
We are not legally obligated to provide both. We do. And we do that, one, in order to make sure that we're meeting the needs of students in the best possible way. And two, we don't offer this at all sites in either situation. And so we are obligated to fulfill the needs of our second language learners. And we believe that from the research and kind of where, from what we're seeing from the students in our program, that TWI is an extremely valuable program in serving our native Spanish speakers well.
Sorry.
And we're legally obligated to provide these services at 90% the general education student population.
In either program, correct?
Correct.
For either ESL or TWI. Okay. But the question, it's a leading question, and if you couldn't tell. And the question, really boils down to why not double down? And if we think this is the appropriate method of instruction that's better for our district, why not make that the case and blow out the number of TWI strands that we're increasing it so that we can meet the entire demand from the native Spanish-speaking population and more, have more English speakers as well.
We need to offer our ESL services because we have students with many other native
Yes,
languages.
right. Of course. No, we wouldn't be able to eliminate. I'm not suggesting we eliminate ESL, please. No.
Yeah. So we need to offer those things, and so it means that our native Spanish-speaking families, because they are right now 65% of our second language learner population, they do have a choice.
Got it. Understood.
It's the best place to meet their needs.
Thank you.
Any other questions about the outreach?
Would it be possible to still have perhaps an all Spanish community convening at all? I mean, if there was time to kind of put it in there. I mean, I went to the convening over in Washington, and there were a couple of Latino families there, but it was more white families. There was some black families there as well. I mean, it's pretty diverse. And again, I really do appreciate that. Again, you and the team actually called folks, because again, there's other ways to access folks. So if we can't have I'm satisfied with 100. I think that's actually really good. So I just kind of want to number one commend you for again, going out there and then not only just doing community convenings, but also looking at different ways to access the communities and folks that again don't usually come out to meetings because they might not have the time and whatnot. So, but if there's any chance to do that, I mean that'd be something to look into. I think.
Okay, and we can note that and see if there's a way. We certainly made an effort through the Bilingual Parent Advisory Committee, but we have opened that up to native Spanish-speaking families and families of other languages. And then my timing was pretty poor on the Washington event because it was the same day as the Mexico City earthquake. So we did have limited participation.
Yeah.
But from the native Spanish-speaking population.
Absolutely, yeah. And then again, that was the timing of it was a little off, but I do appreciate again having done the phone surveys and reached out to Black and Latino families, and if we can find other ways to again try to use whatever means necessary we can to communicate with families. It's as opposed to just always asking them to come to us. I mean, I think this is the right start, and I commend you and the team for doing that.
Stacy, about how many people came to the BPAC meeting?
We had the attendance was probably about 20. I would have to pull the sign-in sheet. We started a little small, but by the end, I think we were about 20. Does that seem right, Rebecca?
Yeah,
15 to 20?
about.
Yeah, I was part of those conversations too. It started off small, but then as the BPAC conversation, people picked up the tweets conversation. People started pulling in more folks. We ended up with about 22 folks at the very end.
But I will add that as part of that conversation at that BPAC meeting, a big concern was the ESL program and the expansion for that and the need for that. So, to Lindsay's point and just being able to balance out both programs, I think the ESL program does need to be part of the conversation because you are going to have families that are going to opt out. And I appreciate everybody that did come up, but I do still feel that there's a lot of voices that are missing, especially the voices that are going to help us support this no matter what school it ends up at. And so I'd just be curious as part of your work within the next couple of weeks, working with individual communities where it is potential for growth and really talking to the parents and the people that are currently in the program, because siblings do get a preference. You do have that population, and then you did have some voices from the preschool, but I think the communities that are there right now, those are the communities that are going to help us launch this program. And I think my biggest concern is that wherever it is that we place it, that the communities are going to be receptive to it, and then they're going to help us and understand what that work looks like. So if within the next couple of weeks we could somehow talk to the participants in TWI, as well as get an overall climate for the individual schools, I think it would really help the decision making and helping parents be part of what is going to be a community effort.
And you're specifically thinking about that in the places where this potential site for expansion.
Correct.
Oh, thank you, Rebecca.
Yeah, no question about
I
that.
actually have one more question. And maybe it's even a bit before the community outreach part, and that is just it would be helpful, I think, to understand. I wasn't able to attend the community meetings, so this probably was brought up at that point, but what happens if we don't expand TWI?
So if we don't expand TWI, we literally are moving towards a single service delivery model, which would be ESL. Because we are at a point where we are, there was a very kind of poignant question asked at the Washington session, which was, at what point does research no longer support this model? And when you're at 65-35, and in some cases as close to 80-20, it's not, we need to question whether we continue with dual language support, and we have challenges with being in state compliance. So if we fail to expand this model with our current density of native Spanish-speaking speakers, we would be at a position where ultimately we would need to eliminate TWI and move to single language support, which would be ESL.
And I think that's an important point too, just in thinking about the outcome, the measurement, the student outcome scores that we were looking at is that in the recent past, this program has not been implemented with fidelity. So that I would assume would affect test scores.
Can I ask one other data question? I forgot, it made me think of this. So the access slide that talks about the raw scores.
Yes.
In terms of the proficiency measure, so I see that, the TWI students advance over time and surpass the other EL, but is that score or that level at 5th grade, what proportion are considered to be English proficient? And then how does that shift to 8th grade? Because just looking overall at them relative to one another is one thing, but then just generally, how successful we are overall.
So what I would need to do, because I don't have that particular number in front of me, that's something I can take as a follow-up question and get back to you on without a doubt. So this was lifted from was pulled from one of our reports, so I can get that back to you.
No problem. And this is a segue into the next piece, but I did find it interesting that as we're looking at, K-8, the 6 to 8 scores, 6th grade students from TWI, although were doing significantly better than students that had other EL or ESL. By 8th grade, it reversed itself.
Are you looking at the CRV or?
I was looking at those at the 40th percentile.
The 40th percentile, yes.
So,
open to that one.
So I think it's, again, I don't know what N equals, so it's hard to tell, but it was striking to me that when you're looking at the percentage above the 40th percentile in math, former TWI were performing higher than other EL, not as high as never EL, and it was pretty much equal in free and reduced lunch and no free and reduced lunch. It was higher, but by 8th grade for non-free and reduced lunch, former other EL was higher, and free and reduced lunch was higher, not by a huge amount, but the trend changes. And so anyway, that I think for me just kind of parlays to the next conversation of how that continuation of TWI programming could be dampering, not having it could be dampering their continued improvement. But I'm not sure why ESL would get better unless you continue with ESL at the middle school level? Okay.
Students do have ESL.
So I think.
If they continue to qualify.
If they continue. We'll bring it up again then when we talk about criteria, but that speaks to me in terms of the importance of potential for K-8.
And I just think as a point of clarification, my comment about the TWI program was not necessarily that we haven't been implementing with fidelity, it's that we shifted model, and the cohort for which that we moved to a shifted model has just entered 6th grade.
Oh, okay. That does kind of segue into a question that I have about outreach. And I'm wondering if we can understand on the phone survey what exactly parents were asked. In particular, there's language that there's a trend that most parents communicated that a K-8 TWI program would be their preferred option, followed by an equal number of parents valuing TWI at either a magnet or within their neighborhood school. But I know that we eventually want to move to talking about middle school expansion of TWI, and I do think that's an important discussion. But we had decided in the spring, or what we heard from the administration, was that the K-5 expansion was kind of the first step, and then after we had gotten through that we would look into 6 through 8. So I just want to make sure that we're understanding what parents were asked and what they were answering, because if they were responding to, our preference is to see it expand into the middle school space, I don't know if that's directly comparable to where a K-5 expansion would occur. And so, we're saying that an equal number of parents value having it at either a magnet or within their neighborhood school. But because that comparison is happening within the question of, would you like a K-8 model? I don't know what that means. Like, does that mean that people would want to see it at one of our existing K-8 schools? Or that they just want to see it K-8 wherever it is?
My understanding of the question was that it was asked, would you prefer the model to be K-5 or K-8, since it's a reference to a program and not a site? Because the language is here, as a parent surveyed most expressed interest in TWI as a K-8 program.
Okay.
Currently, we are a K-5 program,
right.
So we're not talking about a site, we're talking about a program.
Okay.
And so the questioning was, would your preference be a K-5 program or a K-8 program? And then the questioning moved to, would you prefer to see it within, a neighborhood school? Would it be your home school, or would you be willing to bus to this program? And would you consider attending it at a neighborhood school if it was a magnet school, if it was not your home school? So, and I don't have the exact questions in front of me, but I did have an opportunity to look at those questions and work on those questions a bit in the spring. And so that was certainly the spirit and the general communication in the questions.
Okay.
With the calls that went out, if people did not have knowledge of the program, then we took the opportunity to say, this is what the program is. Mm-hmm. So we did use that as an opportunity to share knowledge of the program, and then people could at that point decide whether they felt comfortable answering the rest of the questions.
And then you mentioned before that these are JEH families that are already being bused to the program at JEH.
They may be, because a percentage of our JEH families are, and
right.
Our JEH population tends to be more engaged in busing than
right.
some of our other school communities.
Do we know where is this a population of people who would be bused to, or is it a concentration of families who are in the 5th ward who would even their attendance area school would be a school they'd be bused to?
So I do not have the specific demographics. We did specifically focus in on Spanish-speaking and Black families, but we did not map through the neighborhood information.
Okay.
But I would say that of the population, they do come from low-income, parts of Evanston. So I think it would be fair to make that connection, that these are probably kids that might already be getting bused to to their elementary school,
Right.
which is important. And I mean, I'm assuming these are phone conversations. There's, you know, I think sometimes in having worked with that population, there isn't always the empowerment of understanding what is this information being collected. You said that it was collected in the spring, so I'm curious as to what the context. Was this part of an overall program evaluation, or was this specific to garnering information for TWI expansion?
This was specific to garnering information for TWI expansion.
Okay.
We had a bilingual team member call so that the questions and conversation could be in native language.
Okay. So again, I think that we need to make another attempt to get more voices that would be directly impacted by an expansion. So, you know, I appreciate the calls and the time that went into making those phone calls, but I think that there's even evident by the turnout and I think by the questionings that we've gotten as a board, I'm a little concerned that people don't really know that this is how this is happening and that it is happening. So I wouldn't want people to feel like they weren't made part of the process or come at it as a surprise that we're having these conversations.
Okay, thank you.
So I really appreciate the feedback about how to hear from other voices, and I appreciate the work that was done to make the phone calls in the first place, because that's definitely a heavy lift. I also am concerned about the imbalance of participation for Black families, and so I'm glad that Black families were contacted in thinking about this expansion. I think there's just been a history in the district of Black children being in programs for demographic gain. And so I think it's really important that we consider the imbalance and how to correct that, but I also think doing it in an intentional way is really important. So I'm wondering if there are also opportunities to actually come together with a family group, or there's the very new, that's only met one time, Black and Caribbean Parent Advisory Group. I wonder if there's other places where parents can be convened to ask Black folks about this information, to share with them about the TWI expansion, but also what their needs might be in terms of participating. And to that end, I also had questions. At the beginning of the presentation, one of the points was that cultural competency or cultural relevancy is embedded in the program for all student backgrounds. And so I just wanted to hear a little bit more about the techniques and pedagogical priorities, curriculum that demonstrate what that commitment is.
Is your question about the way that we go about accomplishing this in TWI? Is that what you're asking?
Yeah, what the current strategies or priorities or curriculum, and maybe if there's an example of how cultural competence is defined and how cultural relevancy for all the students involved is embedded.
So the TWI teachers over the last several years, and this goes back multiple years, have worked collaboratively to develop a series of integrated units, and their reasoning and thinking about that was, one, how do we make sure that the learning is connected as possible so that we can create kind of these connections for our students that are learning in both English and Spanish. In the process of taking kind of district curriculum and thinking about how do these things come together and become integrated units for our students in TWI classrooms, the TWI teachers also have opportunities and have taken opportunities to identify what are the relevant texts that we want to involve, how do we want to shift the particular topics to make them increasingly important and relevant to the students' cultures that are within the classroom. How do we front load some of the necessary vocabulary and images and beliefs so that they can see themselves in this learning and see themselves as central to this investigation and this integrated unit. So there is a lot of work that the TWI teachers have done over time to work on those integrated units, and then we continue to work on how to synthesize those with some of the shifting curriculum work that we're doing. When we think about moving forward, we want to be able to tap into the strengths of those TWI teachers and what they've seen in regards to making integrated units and putting students' identities up front in those units as we look for opportunities to integrate more broadly across our curriculum for all students.
That's great. And it's really exciting that there's that best practice happening, and I can see that there's lots of opportunities to learn in our general ed classrooms from those practices. Given that the Black representation in TWI has been not representational of the population or the applicant pool, I would imagine that some intentional work around not just recruiting, but preparing to serve that student population. I'd be curious to hear more about if there are plans for that. And in general, not just for the recruitment of Black families, but also just in our district, considering a really broad lens about cultural relevancy. I am curious if there are also Afro-Latin or Black Latinx curricular focuses in our TWI program.
So I would probably need to, my instinct is very much to say yes, but I would need to dig a little bit deeper to make sure that I was talking from fact. But my deep belief is that the answer to that is yes, but I don't have a specific example to share with you on that one.
Okay.
Can I share something with you I saw today? So today at Dawes, we had a Hispanic Heritage celebration, and this was done by teachers, right? And it was the whole school. Mm-hmm. So the whole school performed they performed a story, an ancient indigenous story about how music came to the world. So each, everybody from kindergarten on to 6th had a part to play. They sang in Spanish, they danced to Spanish songs as the story was told. Then I walked in to observe my son's 5th grade TWI teacher, Mr. Senra, who's just absolutely incredible. And he had his students do presentations about Hispanic heritage, and so we had somebody present about notable. One of the students presented about notable Latinos in history, and there was a Puerto Rican parent who talked about Mr. Senra right off the bat said one of the parents who's Puerto Rican said we also got to include somebody's notable is like we love music, right, and we got to note Celia Cruz and Tito Puente, and Mr. Senra right off the bat, it's like, okay, you know what, that would be a good connection because that would be an Afro-Latino, which we could talk about in that connection, right, in regards to having Afro-Latino influence in our culture. So, and I want to think that it was, again, that came from just, one, he's just like that. Mr. Senra is like that, but I want to think about how, at the beginning of the year, we started very strong in regards to the first day of school when the teachers came back, and we had that presentation about, being very intentional about being multicultural and having these concerns as we teach. And I think the message, I want to hope that message really kind of has permeated, and as I talk to teachers here and there, I'll ask them, like, so how are you incorporating things, and they're being very thoughtful about how they're thinking about it, right, and folks who maybe have not thought about it before are actually now thinking about it. So again, something that we like you're saying, something it's automatic to say it, but I think it's something that we should really look into, and how practice is changing because of this new focus on equity.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I think if we can move on to questions around considerations of site identification now. Does that make sense? Okay.
I just wanted to clarify, when you talked about changing the program model, or like what would happen if we do nothing, ESL is really about supporting students' acquisition of English as an academic subject, and TWI is about academic biliteracy. And those are two very different functional outcomes. And I think there's values latent within the choice that's made there, right? I just want to make sure that I'm understanding and that we're saying out loud, like, that there's a big difference between those.
There's a very big
with no judgment for people who choose ESL as a support for their children.
And that is kind of going back to Lindsay's question earlier tonight. But your point is absolutely correct. The goals of the two programs are different. So to say that, by not adding to our TWI offerings, essentially what we would be doing is at a point, we'd hit a breaking point with our TWI program where we couldn't fundamentally offer it again anymore.
Right.
And so it's not necessarily, it would be ending kind of a biliteracy offering because we no longer can offer it with fidelity and with an appropriate balance to deliver the program well to students. And it is the goal of TWI is to develop in English and in Spanish.
And can I ask one question just about program fidelity before we get to site offerings? So we're looking at the graphs, looking at the data. So you cite Thomas and Collier, and there's that nice graph. And the Escamilla work, that gray in the biliteracy zones. Thinking about a K-5 delivery model versus a K-8 option, it just seems tough for me sitting here to support any change that doesn't, I mean, you gave me a graph that has a yellow line that's still going up in grades 6, 7, and 8, all the way to 11th grade, but we don't offer the 6, 7, and 8.
Yeah.
And it just seems very strange that we can't find a way to define how that would look here and support that. Even though we've heard it from parents, but like we also now have like this research in front of us that says that's the best.
And I think, research, and particularly that research from Thomas Collier, does support that this model should continue. And I would very much like to be able to move to that conversation at a point. In our thinking, and what I've shared in the community forums, was that if we are at a point where we are not delivering the K-5 model with fidelity, in my opinion, we need to address that first and then move our thinking pretty quickly to how can we find ways to deliver core instruction in 2 languages in the middle school to address that kind of next step. But our first fidelity check is, are we doing right by the kids with the model that does exist?
And that supports what you were saying about thinking about not just adding 1 strand somewhere, but a place that maybe could hold 2 strands because of growth and history. But it's also, I'm looking at the equity report where 4B was strengthen and fully integrate ACC and TWI into a single instructional approach was a recommendation. And I'm curious to know where that is in a consideration, what that looks like. I have in the back of my head, like, what's the ideal if we were building this from the ground up? What would be the ideal model? And why can't we do that? And I'm sure there's rational constraints for why we can't do certain things, but at some point it'd be good to understand what would be the ideal. In terms of like long-term planning part.
Yeah, we are very much working on a long-term plan. As a team, we've spent time digging in from the CNI side to both ACC and TWI, and we're not yet at a point where we're in a position to respond to that recommendation. We're really trying to look at what are best practices, core practices, reasons for those programs existing, what would be intersections, do those intersections work? But in regards to the particular TWI plan, we hear that voice loud and clear about trying to move into middle school, and I think we would like to very much begin to think and talk about that. We do feel like we need to take care of this particular challenge first. And we need to, as Rebecca has pointed out tonight too, this is about identifying a site, and then it's about all the change management that's associated with that, because ultimately we want to take a strong school community and help it become even stronger and increasingly diverse and become an even better place than it is. And so we want to honor strength, understand change, but support a school into doing something, to do something well by bringing in this program.
And set it up for success.
Set it up for success.
Sure.
But, and just to add to that, I thought we're going to talk about this a little later, but I do think that we do have an opportunity to do both things, right? So as we're looking at expanding at potentially a magnet school, we do have that option. So we do have the option to visit working with that magnet school to increase it, to expand it to 8th grade.
Absolutely.
And so I think as part of the conversation that's being had here is if we do want to do it right and we want to hold true to the efficacy of the model, we do have an opportunity to do that right now.
That is true.
Yeah, I would add to Rebecca, I think there's a difference between implementing it now and pursuing a solution that enables it to be implemented more fluidly and in maybe the best possible way. And so I do think, for me, I think like line of sight to that end game is very important in this decision because we shouldn't be making the decision in a vacuum if we know that we ultimately want to get there. So while I wouldn't say, I'm not at all saying execute it next year, but having the thought process be inclusive of that as a goal, and all the data supports that. I think there is an open question of what happens at the high school, because I don't know there, and that articulation, and which is probably another day, but I couldn't agree with you more. We have the ability to at least move ourselves in a direction that would facilitate that when we're ready.
Right. But I would point out, though, that we're adding 1 or 2 strands, or we're talking about that right now, but I think the 6 through 8 expansion, which I think is important, but that's going to happen, or that will ultimately need to happen probably at all of our middle schools at some point, because we have TWI programs, or at least at a couple of our middle schools where we have the TWI programs, the classrooms currently that are feeding into those middle schools. Or we would transfer them all to the
conversation.
Yeah.
No, would be the best way to do those things. And
right.
Certainly.
Right.
Yeah. That's why, to begin middle school conversation is an important conversation, but in the same way that we've got a list of like 12 to 14 factors here,
right.
In that we have to think about what would be the impact of needing to have bilingual staff teach, Spanish-speaking staff,
right.
staff to teach content, and what's the right way to step
right.
into something like that. So that's why eyes here for a minute, and then as we look forward, because
right.
when I say eyes here, we are very much thinking in the K-5 space, what is the right long-term decision? To get to this point, sorry, I've done that twice now, to get to this point has been a difficult set of conversations. And so we want to give this board a recommendation that is going to move us to a place where we see being able to get back to 50-50 for the program over time. And that means, we're not talking about dropping a K-5 strand in anywhere. We're talking about starting at kindergarten or kindergarten and first grade,
right.
and stepping the program out.
Right.
And so that'll get us to that 50-50 over time. But we want to give you a recommendation that's going to get you to K-5 50-50, and then
right.
think about the right change so this becomes a positive change. And then think about the efficacy of the program says going K-8 is important, so what would be the steps
right.
later? And I don't want to put any assumptions on the record about
right.
what that might be.
No, I guess what I'm saying is, the 6 through 8 expansion would not be just for this strand or 2 strands that we're adding. That when we discuss it, we would be discussing it for all of our existing strands on how it would work for those students, regardless of where
But
it is.
in some ways, to Rebecca's comment, a lot of times what we do is we pilot things.
Right.
We try things out.
Understood.
In certain spaces.
Yeah.
We figure out how
absolutely.
things work. All that.
And I know we're talking about 1 or 2 strands. If there's 84 TWI native Spanish speakers currently in TWI or thereabouts,
Yep.
to get to 50-50, we'd need to accept more of the TWI native English speakers, right?
Right.
So if we just added 1 section, that would give us about 24 kids in a class. And I'm not sure that jives with the 90% number, so we need 2.
We see 2 being the answer.
We need 2 to get to the 90%.
Maybe 1 next year followed by a second, but
Okay.
we would give we would say our recommendation would be to open both next year, or 1 next year and 1 in 2 years at these sites.
Great.
One more really quick question. Hopefully it's really quick, I promise. But along the same lines of trying to create a solution that looks into the future, would we consider or ever expanding TWI to another language?
Right now, we don't have the density of second language speakers in any other language. The only site that has more than 20 students, which is a threshold for delivering services, in native language. Walker, we have 20 Arabic students. But that's the only place where we have a density that hits that 20 threshold. And the numbers, and I had it in front of me, the district right now is 65% native Spanish speakers, and then the remaining 35% are over 40 different languages.
Thank you.
Just a point of clarification that Stacy just said fast. In recommending a strand at K to 5, it doesn't mean we're recommending to go in all K through 5.
Right.
It means implementing in a scaffolded way over time to be able to address these concerns.
Thank you for that.
I just wanted to build on that question Lindsay talked about, and an experience I've had at a school my kids were at a couple of years ago was that we were in the one school that had a two-way immersion program, but every other kid had an option to take what's called FLES. It's foreign language in the elementary schools, and that's a period. So there was a FLES teacher who comes into the school, and there were actually two teachers. So there was a German teacher and a Japanese teacher, and kids had the option to take it a couple of times a week during their lunchtime, so it didn't cut into, the regular break. So parents would opt their kids in if they wanted to, 2 or 3 times a week, and they would have these. So again, offering different language tracks is an option. It's not as immersive. It's not the best model, but it's again, some kids will pick it up because they just have the capacity to do it, right? And the support. So something to think about in the future. Again, it's just to kind of provide us an option to discuss in the future.
So I do want to move on to the considerations for the site expansion. And you gave us the subset of what you have identified as the most important. And so I think starting with a discussion of those and seeing how, I think this is an important opportunity for us to give feedback on whether we agree with that subset, if we would add to it, what our perspective from hearing from community members is on that issue. So does anybody want to start on that?
I will. Nobody else wants to start? Okay. So I already alluded to this. The idea of having options for K-8 to me is very important. And not that we are implementing it now, but that there's a way to do that, not to preclude it from happening ultimately many places, but the reality is we're not going to start it everywhere first. So having a site path to that. The single strand concept and isolation, there are people who are no longer on this board, who were on this board when it was first conceived, when TWI was first conceived, and throughout that process and the wobbly years that started out, a lot of it was because of the isolation of a single strand. And so I believe it's absolutely critical that we don't have a single strand in a school. I think that's more important for the TWI side, but I also see on the monolingual side, and this is, educators say this all the time, we need flexibility in our classrooms that we can mix kids around when they go from grade to grade. There's a huge issue that gets presented when you have a class of kids and you need to mix some of the dynamics and you have no way of doing that. I think that shows up in the learning, it shows up in the social emotional, it shows up in behavior. So I strongly would advocate for a way in a place where we're not going to isolate any single strands. So I think that obviously, shifts down. We only have two schools, correct, that have 4 strands? Because you were talking about 4-strand schools?
There are
3 schools.
Oakton, Dewey. You mean, are you actually 3 monolingual or 4 monolingual?
Just 4 strands, period.
So our schools that have 4 classrooms per grade are Oakton, Dewey, Willard, Lincoln. Did I get them all?
Oh.
Wait, not Oakton.
Washington, doesn't?
Washington, thank you.
Yes, okay.
Sorry.
Okay. All right, so I think, it kind of that drives some decisions, because you ultimately, if you have, to your question of having 2 strands now and adding a 3rd there, if it's a 4-strand location, it's going to have one that's isolated. If it's a 3-strand location and they don't have any when they get 2, it's going to be isolated. So, so that kind of constrains my head. I think the other piece about it is that we want a place where we can build a shared sense of community around bilingualism. I mean, it seems like the best outcome is that we're building a place that's about bilingualism and that's celebrating that throughout the school. Not that that's not done when there's a couple strands first, but to me, it just seems to be, it is a celebration, and it's an opportunity to have celebration around community. So I think that, like, the place where you can build the most robust community as a whole of a bilingual school, and the cultural competence and how that could grow into being examples for the other places that are going to still have strands, but be a breeding ground for practices, I think is also a priority. So that's me.
Point of clarification on what you just said, that could lead us to an all TWI school.
Yeah, I think it could. I mean, I have busing concerns, but the reality is, I think as Rebecca said earlier, and this would be important data I think that we should have, is when you look at where native Spanish-speaking students, where the highest demand is, are those students already being bused? Because clearly one of the cons was we don't want to bus, disproportionately bus students. However, I think there's a value in creating a community, number one, and there's also an issue of we may be busing these kids out of their home attendance area already, just by virtue of the way we're structured. So I think it would be good to have that data in terms of current demand and then future demand, what geographically, where is that coming from? And is busing, is busing going to be a net new thing, or is it going to be the same? But having both groups being bused, right? So that they're, so anyway.
I think that the way that the city of Evanston demographic layout goes is that the two areas where I see is having higher Latino concentration. One of them is a busing area, so that's the west end of Evanston. But then we do have, areas closer to the 2nd and the 9th ward that are also high concentration Latino populations. We do have a magnet school within that, that area. So I think it's important to just, overlay the demographics that we have available through the city and see what that looks like. And I think you would find that there's a lot more possibility in making sure that we are keeping families close to schools and reduce the busing.
Yeah, I would definitely, in the conversation I went to at Washington, I heard a significant focus from some of the folks in my breakout group for looking for proximity. We didn't specifically talk about busing, but I think folks were looking for the opportunity to not have to be bused. So I wonder if in between time, if those kind of specific questions are answered or are asked of populations that would be affected. That because if we considered a K-8 option at a magnet school, then that would involve busing likely. And then we may have other neighborhood school options that would require minimal busing, but not be that K-8 opportunity. So I'm curious to hear more about hearing from specific people about what trade-off would be preferable.
Along those lines, in the equity report that we saw in the spring, we saw that one of the recommendations was about looking at boundary lines and trying to eliminate the disproportionality of busing. So, to select a location that either creates new busing or even just keeps it the same for the same populations, to me would be problematic because it wouldn't seem to be responding to that recommendation that we've already received, and especially if, thinking to the future, if that is something that we are going to address. I think in terms of having a minimal overhaul disruption, for creating a program where there's some busing here, but then if we do decide at some point down the line to look at boundary lines, to eliminate that busing, and then that kind of upends things again. I think trying to be as forward thinking as possible, and not just with that recommendation, but with any, cost reduction planning that we might have for the future, to try as much as possible to anticipate and take that into consideration, understanding that, of course, not all of that can be considered.
And I think that's spot on, and I think it begs all sorts of questions. If this recommendation goes to one of our magnet schools, that's a different boundary conversation because they're magnet schools. And if the question I just asked of Candace, if we were to choose one of the schools as ultimately a TWI school where we would add 2 strands, potentially, that could beg some questions about boundaries if that school went from a neighborhood school to a full TWI neighborhood school.
Right.
So there's a domino effect there that as we, in our game plan this year on the boundary conversation, it's to really frame how we jump into the boundary conversation. This may, depending on how we ultimately land as a recommendation or what you decide as a board, this may accelerate that conversation.
I also do want to, we're talking about ultimately that we need 2 strands. They don't necessarily need to be 2 strands at one school. I mean, because we currently have a number of single-strand TWI programs. So if the idea is ultimately to eliminate having a single strand, it could be 1 strand at one school and another strand at a different school.
It certainly can be. Some of the very factors that you've already talked about play out in those decisions as well, in the sense that if it's a 3-strand school, then if you're adding in one, you do create a single strand of the monolingual. And then when we look at our TWI schools, and Ms. Powley again brought up some of this too, some of our TWI schools do tend to be in our schools where we have some of the higher average monolingual class sizes, which makes adding an additional TWI strand potentially a challenge, because again, you have to think about displacement of students. So absolutely a possibility, but again, it's how the different factors begin to play together.
And we were talking earlier that the perfect may be the enemy of the good here, and that, to get all the variables together is potentially just not possible. And so how do we, again, go to priorities and then go to what really drives offerings for kids, performance for kids, offerings for families, and that sense of community.
Oh, I forgot to ask something. So to the point about previous performance, specifically in Washington, because it is the only 2-strand school, it would be, we have this commitment that we believe, based on lots of anecdotal data, that it's better. I know operationally and from a management standpoint, it seems to be better from a community building, but do we have evidence in our data that students are performing at a better rate there versus single-strand school?
The program performs well, but it is not our highest performing academic TWI program in the district.
Okay.
Can you compare them that way?
Is it there are lots of other factors?
Using the metric that thank you, I appreciate that. But using the metric that we are using as part of our analysis right now, which is % of students reaching the DRA and EDL benchmarks, we see that Washington is a strong performing school, but there are other TWI schools that are single strand that are performing as well or better in that particular metric.
Okay.
And my curiosity,
as you point out, there are lots of, when you talk about, there are lots of different things from which you could evaluate a program.
and longitudinally, I don't know, but if we had the data longitudinally, Washington may have a higher percentage of growth compared to starting points and stuff. There's a lot we don't know there.
Yeah.
Based on the one metric I'm looking at right now.
I just don't want to judge a program, but yeah.
And that's why I even hesitate in some ways to answer that, because there is value in all of the TWI programs in our district, and there are some very high levels of performance, and there's some strengths in a number of places, in all of them.
Go ahead.
No, I'm talking too much. I'm shutting up.
No, you're good. One of the things that I think I would be looking for in our follow-up discussion is hearing more about the selection criteria and how that is being adjusted in order to allow for more demographic diversity in the 2 areas that you highlighted in your presentation. There was also, I spoke with a parent who talked about needing to have her child transferred because we only offer special needs services in Spanish in some schools. Is that correct?
So it depends on the type of special education services that are required. We have specialists, psychologists, special education teachers, reading specialists that are bilingual in the schools where we provide TWI services. There are situations where certain specialized services that are more uniquely required are only offered in certain sites.
Okay.
And in some cases that overlaps with our TWI schools, and in some cases it does not.
Okay. So I don't know how often this occurs, but I would be curious to hear if that is a part of the selection criteria that I think in this particular instance, her oldest child needed to be at a particular school in order to be in TWI and receive services, and then the sibling wasn't initially allowed, and because she knew how to advocate for herself, she was able to get the transfer for that younger sibling, but otherwise she may not have. So I don't know how that's a part of the...
We've had conversations about how you weigh the different types of services that are offered at a school. And to some degrees it's challenging too, because you want to make sure that schools are able to execute the number of programs that they have well. And so we definitely have those things on our radar in any situation when we're deciding TWI schools, ESL schools, places for self-contained classrooms, those types of things, like what the impact is on where we offer them and where we don't.
Okay. And then we talked about the fact that, change management is going to be a part of this process. And I'm really curious, as we continue to talk about this, what's going to be in place in order to, particularly if it was a school that received, if we were considering an all TWI school, what would be in place in order for that change management to happen over time in a way that everyone felt connected and a part of the institution all the way up to the last fifth grade class that has monolingual classes. And so I'd just be curious to hear more about how we're thinking about that and how that's part of the selection process, if that is the option that's presented.
Thank you.
In speaking about different voices to be heard in the decision, I think it would also be helpful to know a bit more about the recommendations of TWI teachers. I've only had the chance to speak with one former TWI teacher, and her main concern was over the isolation issue, and that there were a lot of operational inefficiencies that occur with having the strands spread across so many different schools, particularly like something about like a very high inter-office mailing cost. But that should really definitely be part of the consideration, what the teachers' input is. And then also, I think it would be beneficial to hear a little bit more about the students who aren't in TWI, so the monolingual classes, and what their perspective is on TWI as well. Again, very anecdotally, the feedback that I've heard from people I know is that there's a lot of othering that happens at schools that have one TWI strand. So again, talking about the issues of the isolation of having a single TWI strand, and it does, I think, impact the entire school. When there is that othering, I think that's not the intention of the program at all. So I think that if that was the solution that was proposed, being able to figure out what are the supports given to that school to ensure that that divide doesn't occur or doesn't occur as materially.
I just wanted to...
It's important to say that whichever decision we make, we're going to end up with some schools with one strand. We're not going to eliminate all the one-strand schools, and so that's just going to have to be a piece of the puzzle.
I think she meant in making the next decision. Right? Making the next decision.
For the second strand?
Right. Or, making this next decision, or even in the current situation, right? That there, should be some consideration spent to make sure that a school like Willard, even if they're not going to gain a strand, they're not going to lose the strand that they currently have. But what do we do in those communities to foster like a Willard community that's not segregated on TWI. Because I think that's no one wins in that situation. It's not good for anyone.
So many of our school climate committees are addressing that directly. That is part of the rollout of that. So I'll just say that I know it's not directly related, but I will say that it's definitely a topic of agenda and is a source of a lot of the things that come up, and was part of the equity report that came up in terms of that isolation. So I know it definitely became front and center for many teams.
I just wanted to add on to that again. I think when we talk about isolation, that becomes an issue of school climate, right? Is the staff able to collaborate? Our TWI teachers, sitting down at grade level, is the third grade TWI team sitting down with the third grade gen ed team and having conversations about how their work occurs and unfolds. So just to kind of reiterate, and that's what's in my mind is when I hear there's isolation. To me that having been a bilingual teacher, again there had always been that sense of isolation, right? And we were told, I'd been told to collaborate with your general ed colleagues, but a lot of times it really wasn't. The feeling wasn't mutual. Part of it again is you're the bilingual teacher and you handle those bilingual kids, and we're the gen eds and we do that, and that's kind of how things have historically unfolded for bilingual programs. But again, going back to our goals around equity, I think that we've planted seeds here for people to start thinking about that historical isolation that happens within school climates. And I think that's going to help us get to that point where, we have a culture wherever these strands end up, you have a culture that ends up embracing, the program and the diversity that the program brings. And the benefits, right? Because a lot of times, again, it goes back to this deficit view in American education. I think that kind of permeates when we talk about kids of color in our educational system, and planting these seeds of equity. I think that, they're going to grow. And again, today I saw it. I saw everybody, every kid, black, white, Latino, was singing Spanish songs. I'm like, wow, that is. It took my breath away. And that is something, again, that is a result. It's a seed that's growing in regards of equity, at least in school, in my school, and in the experience that I've had. So hopefully, that we're going to get to that isolation issue wherever this strand ends up. And for me, it's more of that school climate work where we really need to have those conversations.
And to Lindsay's point of othering, and to your comment about deficit model, I heard it in the words. It's not TWI program and general education team. They're all general education kids, right? Correct. There's TWI and monolingual. Yep. Like even how we talk about it, we want everyone to feel valued. Like it's not like the monolingual classrooms are general ed and TWI's not.
And I don't think that the solutions necessarily need to be grand. Like I think that simple tasks can accomplish a lot. Like recess and lunch are really good opportunities for kids to get a chance to be exposed to one another in a really meaningful and fun way, and just a little bit of push can probably make a significant amount of difference in some of that isolation that's happening. It doesn't necessarily only need to be academic.
You're right. Yeah, I agree.
Right. But if in a daydream, we did have a TWI school, we would be doing away with different strands at other schools, correct?
A TWI school,
not necessarily.
at this point, would not require doing away with TWI strands from another school, because it could be a situation, it does not preclude that. It could be a situation where we have a school with one or two existing strands and you add.
But like over time, I would think we would want to have, as we talk about this idea of community and the efficacy of the program, I would think that focusing on one school as a biliterate, bicultural school, there wouldn't be a need to have multiple strands at other schools.
So what we've identified essentially is that we think that the right size is 8 strands of TWI. We're at 6. We think we need 2 more to get to 50-50 based on kind of second language, Spanish second language speakers. The largest buildings that we have in the district have 4 classes of each grade. So even if we were to meet that 8-strand demand by creating TWI schools, you would need still 2 4-section schools if you were ever to get to that at that point. We have no buildings that have more than 4 classes per grade. And so from that point of view, what we're talking about here is, there is potential with this conversation to potentially end up with a TWI school, but still have single or double strands in other places. And I think part of the change piece of it is that where TWI strands exist, the schools value those programs in their schools. And so this conversation at this point in time is not about pulling TWI strands out of schools. It's about meeting that demand need. And then we continue to think about how do we deal with the certain aspects of isolation from our single strands. And that may take over time some looking at, do we consolidate where we see other growth patterns? That's a possibility. But this is about getting to enough strands and not creating any more individual strands and possibly eliminating by adding the single strands in certain places by going 1 to 2 or 1 to 3.
Okay.
And the steps along the way here are to, again, add the 2 strands K5 and then to do consideration of the 6, 7, 8 and how do we move forward in that way.
Can I add one other point? I just want to make sure in my comments I'm also clear that I don't know if we still have our core value statement, but I believe one of our core values is still neighborhood schools, and we also have a core value of having magnet schools. And so I think that, I'm professing a particular point of view about having a community of magnet, a program that would be an all-TWI school. I still have a very core value of having neighborhood schools and giving people neighborhood school options. So that may pretty much guide make my thinking available, but I want to be very clear on where my thinking is coming from, because Paul, you said it, it could be, I'll stop there, but I don't think the elimination of a neighborhood school is the right answer.
Well, but I think we have to look at we might be eliminating a neighborhood school for a certain population. Well, so put it another way, I think with some of these choices, we are going to be eliminating a neighborhood school for a certain segment of the population. Right now in our district, and historically, we've had, it's our historically marginalized populations who have been displaced out of neighborhood schools. We can choose to continue that path, or we can try to at least stem it to what we have and not continue to place the burden of busing on marginalized populations. So I think that needs to be a consideration. And I think not just for our Latino population, but if one of our goals is to try to increase Black students into the program, then I think not only is the consideration of where our Latinos, our Spanish-speaking students situated, but where our higher concentration of Black students that we would be trying to get into the program situated. So that because since one of our preferences is related to attendance area, I think that would be an important consideration. Because as our speaker earlier this evening said, outreach alone isn't enough if we can't actually accept those students in, even if it is in part because of our own, the way our preferences line up.
Well, that's selection criteria, but I think to Rebecca's point, we do have to look at overlaying, where folks live.
Right.
And unfortunately, we're not going to correct the problem of busing from the 5th Ward with this change. I mean, we're not.
No, but we don't necessarily have to exacerbate it either.
I'm not sure I'd understand how we would exacerbate it. But maybe I'm just missing the specifics.
Well, I'm just
They're
saying.
already getting bussed out. So I guess maybe like determining the proximity to the location would be a consideration for that area. But right now, demographic wise, it's there's two areas in Evanston that still have, larger Latino populations. And this data is from 2010. I think, the city might be able to provide more recent data, but of those kids in the Fifth Ward, they're all still getting bussed out, unfortunately. But for the schools where we have proximity to still be neighborhood schools, I think that should be strong in the consideration. That should be looked at heavily.
And second and ninth are, just because not everybody knows where I know where the second is, but I'm not even sure.
Location-wise?
Yeah.
Okay.
Second is
Main
west.
Street to Oak.
Second is kind of runs, it's just south of the Fifth Ward down, and it kind of cuts over to Washington School. It's a kind of an L, it's Braithwaite's ward.
Yep.
And then ninth.
Right, so Chicago Avenue all the way to McCormick, with Main Street
Main to
being,
Oakton.
Main to Oakton. Then there's a, significant population in the second and the eighth ward as well, so.
So the 8th ward is the ward that borders Howard Street.
Right.
9th ward basically starts at Oakton and goes to Chicago Avenue. And so the concentration as we know it demographically is in the 8th, the 9th, the 2nd and the 5th. I mean, are where large populations of Latino families live.
Yeah, our largest native Spanish-speaking populations, when we look, are currently in the Oakton and Dawes neighborhoods, and then where we see the greatest growth is in the Lincolnwood, which, when we look at addresses, is predominantly coming out of Fifth Ward.
Okay.
And that's in our K-5 space. So
Correct.
we've got different, and that's in the FAQ document.
Another set of selection criteria that I've heard about, and I'm not sure, I don't have a whole lot of clarity around, but I've heard from someone that they were very concerned about the neighborhood preference, and that some neighborhood schools, children would have a very low chance if they don't have a TWI strand within their neighborhood school, would have a very low chance if they are English speakers, native English speakers, of getting into the TWI program because of the neighborhood preference for the other schools. And I know this particular family was a family with a black child. Has there been discussion about that set of selection criteria, narrowing or changing the demographics of children who are in the program?
So one of the things that Ms. Piley talked about tonight, and she's been in conversation with Peter Goddard, one of the things that when we look at selecting people into programs is that, and she mentioned this earlier, is that if schools have higher average class sizes or getting up closer to class size guidelines, that students may get preferenced into programs, be it magnets or TWI, in order to manage some of those enrollments. And so part of the conversation, the comment tonight was that that in kind of those unintended consequences pieces, our schools that tend to have lower average monolingual class sizes do tend to be on Oakton and Dawes in the south end of town, and some of the schools with the higher average class sizes, those students may at times receive some preference to get into the programs because it's managing class sizes. But what, part of what we've talked about is you certainly have heard those comments and concerns, and have opened up that conversation about are there, and the Research Accountability and Data team was already clearly looking at this, but are there unintended consequences that come about in some of our enrollment management?
Is there a timeline for us looking at that part of it, the selection criteria, or from a policy standpoint? Are you guys envisioning that happening in conjunction with this?
That conversation is beginning, but I'm not comfortable answering a time frame on that.
Did you have something?
But that would call for a change of policy, and then we do have to be respectful of the law of the land and being respectful and wanting to diversify. But what does that really mean in terms of how we and how you would create policy, enrollment policy?
Yeah. I know.
I just had a question about, because we've talked about possibly like a TWI school, we've, adding strands in places that already exist. If we were to select a site that doesn't currently have TWI in it, What other staffing aspects have to change to make that school have the capacity to communicate and engage with their families in multiple languages?
So when we move to a TWI school, there are several things that we look at. In talking to the bilingual team is confident in the fact that the principal doesn't necessarily need to be a native Spanish speaker, but there should be an administrator in the building that is a native Spanish speaker. We also then look at support staff. We work to make sure that psychologists, social workers, special education teachers, reading specialists, individuals, educators within our district that work across students and across classrooms are also bilingual and have the opportunity, so therefore can best serve our native Spanish-speaking families. And so those are the places that are most immediately impacted. Secretary of School is also one that is impacted because the ability to communicate to families in both languages is incredibly important as well. In those positions, we do have people that work across schools, and so at times you might have a psychologist that works across 2 TWI schools, things along those lines in order to make sure that we provide support. So it is not important that 100% of our special education teachers are bilingual there, but certainly that a good percentage are, to make sure that we're delivering the necessary services.
So in thinking about a new site, one of the constraints might be a large number of staff that aren't credentialed to service that population, and possible even reductions in force because job programs and job descriptions have changed? Is that a possibility?
And it's understanding the kind of the bilingual, the percentage of bilingual employees in certain job categories across district. Because for those particular positions and points, they tend to serve across schools or move across schools based on needs at points. But that absolutely is consideration of what would be the impact on not just the classroom teaching positions,
culture,
but the other positions that are extremely necessary for us to provide high quality services for students and families.
Sure.
I want to clarify one thing though. In the transition of a TWI strand into a school where it would be replacing a monolingual strand, the teacher who would be teaching in that class would move so that we could bring in the TWI teacher. That teacher more than likely and almost in all circumstances would find a place in the district just because of transitions every year.
I was asking more about all those.
No, I know, but I just want to make sure that
aren't as easily transferred.
If there was that transition, again, there's no guarantees in life, but the landing of a very fine teacher who's teaching now in a monolingual class, there are typically openings in the next school year where we're able to place people, and so in terms of reduction of force, it's a shifting of force, is what it is.
But it certainly is a shifting of the culture in that school,
Absolutely.
and so there would be
and the sports, which is
right.
really
So just in the interest of looking at the time because I think for the most part what I'm hearing from people up here is that the subset of considerations that you had pulled out for the most part are, I think, similar to the concerns we have in terms of eliminating the isolation of a single strand, considering busing impacts, we didn't necessarily specifically talk about some of these other ones, but I'm assuming that nobody has a concern or thinks that there's a misplaced importance on one of the subsets that was in the presentation. What I heard additionally that wasn't necessarily in that initial grouping but has been raised is considering an option that would give a clearer path to adding a 6 through 8 TWI option. Shared sense of community around bilingualism, but I think that the school culture and openness to the program, I think, and elimination of the single strand, I think that's all similar. Understanding I think this kind of gets to busing in neighborhood schools, but the selection criteria and how that might need to be adjusted to fulfill some of the other goals we might have around the expansion. And then the staffing impacts and what those would be.
And the little thing of the financial impact, obviously.
That was going to be sort of the next question of And you have in the packet some of the financial considerations, and I think there was the $35,000 for an aid, and some minimal costs for additional materials. I do think, potentially if busing, either to a magnet school or just out of neighborhood schools, I know without having the site, that's difficult to know what that number would be, but I think having kind of a general, broad sense of what transportation costs could be, especially again, as we're looking to be more efficient, if we're adding transportation costs, I think that would be important to note. Are there any other financial impacts that?
Our material costs are pretty similar. There would be slightly more material costs if we went into a school that did not have TWI, because we need to think about equipping a library and general signage and overall welcome. So a school that has yet to have TWI would have an added expense.
I would also be in the scheme of overall planning, I'd like to know whatever the cost number is that's associated with adding the strands. That's beyond the scope of our budget. I'd like to know what the counter is and where that money is going to come from to balance, which I know isn't the most fun ideating process, but I think it's important that we're not just thinking about adding, but where might that be balanced out somewhere.
Are these costs already baked into the budget that we just approved? Or the cost at least that you've outlined?
There are funds in the curriculum line that we could support the conversion to, and keep in mind that this is a fairly small ongoing cost for a number of years.
Right. But it wasn't itemized that way, right?
English language curriculum, but we'd need to add in Spanish language books and Spanish language curriculum.
And from a staffing standpoint, that would hit next year's fiscal?
So materials for the most part would hit this fiscal because we want to make sure those things are in place. And physical staffing, the teaching assistant would hit next fiscal year, but that's the only personnel piece that would be an additional cost. Okay. Materials we most likely would work out of this year's budget.
And I can't make a real educated guess on our transportation costs. That said, we have a myriad of buses going across, through, around, and in town. So there's possibilities there. And then B, we're also trying to decrease some of those across town buses. And so how do we both find efficiencies and how are we still able to deliver children to the appropriate school? I think it can be within the costs that we're spending now.
And we're trying to think about more specifically kind of like what would be the delta on number of students bused, and then we could try to put an associated cost to that. But do we see this increasing the number of kids bused by roughly what? Do we see it decreasing by what? And again, it's a tough estimation for a number of different reasons, but we are trying to pay attention to what would we see as the kind of end impact be. Would we see it ultimately increasing the number of kids that are bused in comparison to where we are now, or decreasing?
Yeah, or even we know that there's a cost. If a higher percentage of the teaching and learning budget's going to go towards covering some of the costs there, just good to know where that money's coming from so that we're not talking about it like it's just an add-on.
Oh yeah, no, we're not thinking about it just as an add-on.
Right, I'm also concerned, in addition to the TA, just the support, the additional support staff, in particular a social worker. So I know that our social worker currently is they're pulled into many directions, many schools, and I know that they're pretty stressed out in just the amount of work that they currently have. So you're going to need an additional, not just a TA, but also potentially another social worker to take on these additional classrooms and expansion. And that's something that's very necessary to support these families. So I think that you should consider that as well. We
can certainly consider it, I think, to understand the part of it. So yes, I can understand it from need. The number of students that we're serving currently would be approximately the same. But I do.
Right, but as far as location, right? So they're assigned to certain schools, and so that that you take that into consideration if at a new school that's not already being serviced by the social worker.
That's right.
Appreciate it.
Okay.
And then the other thing that I heard that isn't necessarily a specific, one of these considerations, but just if over the next couple of weeks there can be some additional outreach specifically to Latino families and Black families around some of these issues to make sure that we're hearing those voices and that they're adequately represented in the decision-making. I think that was another thing that I heard as a general consideration to think about. So does that recap it?
Yeah, and we do have African Latino presence in Evanston, and I don't think that we've done a good enough job, reaching out to those families who don't mark Spanish as their primary language in their households, but do come from Latino backgrounds, like Puerto Rico, Cuba, Panama. So those individuals are not being captured, and if they're going into the lottery, there's got to be a better way that we can filter out and make TWI accessible for those families that don't qualify because of language. As we're working to increase the African presence in TWI.
And indeed, that's a longer-term piece, along with trying to inform the decision, it's a longer-term piece on how we actually move forward once a decision is made.
So, yeah, can I clarify? Because you made the point around selection criteria, and we were obviously all on board with we need to look at that and shift it, but that's not going to happen in conjunction with this decision, or as a precursor to this decision, or is it needed? Does the group feel that it's needed to happen as a precursor to the decision? I didn't hear that, so I just want to know if
I don't know that it needs to happen as a precursor, but it sounded like that may be a recommendation that comes with.
Certainly we'd have to run that through policy, but we have heard a very clear pattern of comments that we are in process of talking about.
It sounds like the timing has to be pretty close anyway, because you need to get it ready for the kindergarten registration packets and stuff, right?
Well, yeah, certainly if we change selection for next year, that could be challenging just because it would have to go through policy, and I don't know that we would be able to. That actually segues nicely into, I think, the final thing that I think we need to discuss in terms of timeline. And I just want to clarify so we're looking at November 6th having the recommendation. I think currently we have November 13th as a board meeting following that. Paul and I have talked, and I think I've talked to most of you about changing that to November 20th to give a little bit more time from when we get the recommendation to having that meeting and giving feedback for the team to turn around and incorporate any of that feedback. So I think we're looking at pushing that back to November 20th.
Pushing the regular Board of Ed meeting?
Yes, so not having it on November 13th, but having it on November 20th instead, which is the week of Thanksgiving, but it is still, school is open at the beginning of that week, so hopefully that won't be problematic. And then I believe December 4th.
Did you say 14th or 13th? Sorry, November.
13th.
November 13th is when it's currently scheduled, so we would cancel that meeting and reschedule it to November 20th.
And we're in timeline for reposting that and like notice and stuff. We're good.
Yeah, that. And then December 4th, do I have that right? Would be when we would vote on it, and that gives Peter and the team enough time to implement whatever enrollment changes need to happen.
Before late January?
Yes.
Before late January, right. And then that gives enough time. Then we would have to do some outreach and to communities to help them understand the change and process that and what that means for their enrollment. One final question that I had on the time frame that was the next steps is around at what point are you thinking about engaging the school community, the school leaders? Are they going to be a part of informing the decision, or is that happening after November 6th?
So I think I heard two questions in that question.
Okay.
So school leaders will be engaged as part of this process.
Okay.
And prior to coming forward with a particular set recommendation. And then the thinking is that essentially we begin engagement with the recommended site prior to coming in here on November 6th to at least some extent so that this isn't the first place where word gets out that this is potentially the recommended site.
Okay. And school leadership means administrators and teacher leadership?
The near-term engagement, I'm talking about the principals in the school, but prior to that, November 6th, the larger group.
Got it. Okay. Yeah.
One other thing, and that you may want to consider in your deliberations, is another point of feedback that I heard from families across the board, whether they were native English speakers or Spanish speakers, was the importance to families that their older siblings' education experience is similar to their younger siblings. And in considering the growing pains or just in change management in general, that conversation is deliberate and how we think about having that conversation with families is deliberate. That I think in general it's really important for families, from what I've heard, to have continuity in the education experience they have for their children. And if we're thinking about changing the amount of strands in a building, that could certainly impact that level of anxiety and worry for some families. Yeah.
I think for some, it could also open up an opportunity that may not have been there otherwise.
Right.
But I do, and again, all these factors begin to kind of come together in this play of now how do they play out to the best possible scenario. So I do hear that.
Suni, one other request for you and Paul to consider would be, if we are doing the December 4th for the decision, is to make that a regular board meeting versus a working board meeting. So if it tends to, it's a decision that I think the structure of a regular board meeting would be worthy of that, and the publicity relative to our working board meetings would be helpful.
I think that is an excellent point.
Idea. So that would mean, as proposed, that the November 13th regular board meeting would be November 20th, and the December 4th working board meeting would be a regular board meeting.
Correct.
We'll work with the deal on the processes of that.
Yeah, we can see how that affects finance if there's any reason we couldn't postpone finance stuff till later that month.
Right, maybe switch the
Just
regular
switch them?
and working board
Right,
meetings
that's
for
what I
that
was
month.
saying. Just switch
So
those.
that's interesting. So, okay.
Yeah, so then the November 18th, which is currently a regular board meeting.
Could be working board and finance. So that's something, I think that's a good point. I think that we can look into that as well.
Unless there's any other.
Well, just one more comment, and again, again, in all the TWI discussion, I know we mentioned the needs of reaching out to Black families. Just I want to make sure that at some point in our future meetings that we can consider the ACC program as well. I see both of these things should be moving together in any way possible. Again, just want to remind the board that again we should definitely take into consideration the ACC program, and that's been underfunded, it's something that I think that we should definitely think about and it doesn't get lost in this TWI conversation, because again we want to. I'd love to connect both. I'd love to see take on the recommendation that Corey Wallace talked about, where we incorporate elements of the ACC program into some of our TWI expansion if we can.
All right.
I don't disagree, but if we also don't want to do that willy-nilly. We want to make sure that we're well planned.
Absolutely.
And actually, that our curriculum experts have the time to really think about where, whatever we want to do with ACC, we can do well.
Right.
And if there is a linkage, that we would actually do this really quite well.
Whether there's a linkage or not, what I'm hearing, and what I agree with, is that we need to be also considering our other culturally relevant education experts and how we better support and adequately and equitably support those programs.
Isn't that on our map for this year?
Yeah.
Evaluation of ACC?
But we're talking about it now. So.
Yeah, just want to reiterate.
I just wonder, want to make sure that it was.
No.
Absolutely. Okay. With that.
Thank you, Stacy.
Well, can I make a comment before we close?
Sure.
Yeah, so just wanted, for the record, to wish everyone a happy Hispanic Heritage Month and thank the teachers and the staff, not just the TWI classrooms, but all of the district who's doing a wonderful job in celebrating Hispanic heritage. And you know, I've been to a couple of different celebrations at different schools, and it's been a lot of fun. And also, Happy Indigenous People Day today. So thank you for the work that's being done with that population in our school district and being able to share and celebrate as a school district. So just wanted to put that out there for the people that might still be paying attention.
And then, thank you, Rebecca, I appreciate that. I want to, needless to say, but really needed to say, Stacy just stood for 2.5 hours.
Yes.
Stacy also.
Stacy.
Thank you, Stacy. Thank you so much. Thank you to your team. Wonderful.
Stacy and her team have, I really appreciate this, and this is what a working board meeting should be, where we can put issues on the table. And Stacy is well prepared to be able to respond to this because of the work that we've done as an expert team working on these issues, and then really tapping into the multiple communities. So it's to your credit and the team's credit, but really to Stacy's credit for all the good hard work that you've done.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Stacy.
It's incredible.
Thank you. And it really is, it's the benefit of the team and the support of the full team to be able to bring forward all the information and facts that we have. So thank you.
Thank you, team.
Thank you very much. And to show our appreciation, we will adjourn this meeting at 9:37. Thank you.